In a dream I saw God. He was dying. This may seem impossible, since what's immortal cannot die. But somehow, the once immortal God had been made in the image of a mortal man. How God had become a man, and ended up in such an unfortunate situation, was beyond my imagination. Apparently some evil men had cut down a living tree and made dead wooden planks of it. No longer able to grow or bear fruit, this once living tree had been made into the dead, rigid structure of a crucifix, and nailed to this dead, rigid, man-made structure was the form of a man who claimed to be God made flesh. In my eyes, his fate seemed no different from the fate of the tree. The living tree had been made into the image of a dead cross. The living God had been made into the image of a soon-to-be dead man. And the two had been nailed to each other and left for dead. I could hardly tell whether it was the tree, the cross, the man, or the God which spoke to me. All spoke with one voice. "Come closer," said the voice, and I approached with a sublime mixture of horror and compassion. Everyone he knew had abandoned him. He had tried to teach men to love one another, and they had hated him for it. I had heard the story before. There were several different versions of the story, and it had become impossible to separate history from legend. But now here before me, in agony, was the man himself. In a hoarse whisper, he began to speak the first of his last words. "What a fool I was," he cries in sorrow. "Don't say that," I tried to comfort him. "It isn't your fault they didn't listen to you. You were a ray of light in a dark world they just didn't want to see. They prefer the darkness to light. They prefer ignorance to knowledge and foolishness to wisdom. They are the fools." "No, that's not what I meant," he went on. "I was the fool. I was the fool who said in his heart that there is no God." "But you are God," I replied questioningly. "Aren't you? Aren't you God? How could you say there's no God if you are God?" "I am God," he answered. "So are you. So is everything else that exists. God is all that exists. Nothing exists that isn't God. God exists in everything. Everything exists in God. But I was ignorant. I was arrogant. I created all of this. I created the whole universe. I created you too. And I thought it should be obvious to everyone that the simple fact that anything exists at all proves the existence of a creator. I couldn't believe that some people actually doubted my existence. I thought only a fool could doubt that I exist. It turns out I was right, and that fool was me. One day I heard some people down on the earth I made talking about me, and one of them asked the others, who created God if God had created the universe? I had never thought about it before. I was angry at first. I was in denial about it for a while. I denied it because I didn't want to believe in some higher God that could tell me what to do. I realized how hypocritical that probably sounds. But I finally accepted the obvious truth. If everything else that existed had to have a cause, what made me any different? What caused me? How could I come from nothing? Something can't come from nothing. The man was right. If the universe can't come from nothing, then surely I, God, couldn't have come from nothing. Even though there was no evidence of another God, I had to accept the obvious truth that there had to be some other God who created me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But if there's another God who made you, then there would have to be another God to explain that God. And it would go on forever. It would be an infinite regress. If that's the case, we might as well just believe that the universe had no beginning. But it had to. Surely there has to be one first cause that explains everything else. That has to be you. You're the only explanation, I said in frustration. No, he answered. I thought about that too. But if I were the first cause of everything, that would mean that I existed before everything else. I would have had to exist before anything else did. Either I existed before the universe, or else the universe always existed too. And if the universe had always existed, then it wouldn't have had a cause. and my own existence would be unnecessary to explain it. But if the universe didn't always exist, then at some point I had to have caused it. But what would have made me cause it? There has to have been some cause for me to have created it. So what caused me to create the universe? But surely you must remember, I responded. I was confused. How could God forget what happened before he created the universe, I wondered. Isn't he all-knowing? No, he sighed, apparently reading my mind. I don't remember anything that happened before the moment of creation. I've tried, but I can't remember a single thing, and I think I know why. Back when nothing existed, nothing happened. Nothing can happen unless something exists. If nothing existed, nothing happened. And if nothing happened, then what is there to remember? I can't remember anything because there's nothing to remember. My memory only goes back as far as the beginning of creation. There's nothing to remember before that moment. The only thing that existed before that moment was me. But I wasn't even conscious back then. To be conscious is to be conscious of something. Without something to be conscious of, there's no consciousness. Logically, I know that I must have existed. I just wasn't conscious of anything. But I couldn't have existed in any material sense because the material universe hadn't been created yet. I could only have existed as some kind of immaterial, unconscious mind. He was clearly in a lot of pain. I wondered if his mind was starting to go. But what he was saying did make sense in a strange kind of way. I wouldn't expect to be able to completely understand it, though. After all, this was God contemplating the mystery of his own existence and mortality. That is heavy stuff for a human mind. If, he went on, before the beginning of time and space, I was all that existed, and if I existed as something like an immaterial, unconscious mind, then for all practical purposes, nothing existed. Real existence in any meaningful sense of the word begins with consciousness, but since nothing existed other than me, I could only become conscious of myself, and somehow that happened. My first words were, I am. In a sense, I created the words by speaking them, but in a sense, the speaking of those words created me. In a sense, the words created everything there is. The only thing to think about was myself. And to think about myself, I had to form a concept of myself in my own mind. In order to understand that concept, I had to break it into parts. And I found that I could break myself up into an infinite number of parts, and that I could break up each of those parts into an infinite number of parts. I also found that I could combine those infinite parts in an infinite number of ways. This infinite process of knowing myself created infinite time, infinite space, and infinite change. But in a way, this whole infinite universe was an illusion. In truth, I was all that existed. So I was one in essence, but in knowing myself, I existed in three aspects. I existed as the object of my own consciousness, I existed as consciousness itself, and I existed as the perfect mind, which contains consciousness and the objects of consciousness. Every one of the infinite objects of consciousness that have been created represent an aspect of my infinite self. Since each part is infinite, the whole exists in each of the parts, and each of the parts is also a part of every other part of the whole, but it's all just a single thought. It's the thought I think when I think about myself. To give you an analogy, it's like a dreamer inside the dream of the dreaming mind. But this is a nightmare, I exclaimed, and I felt bad for blurting it out. After all, he was suffering more than I could imagine. If this was anyone's nightmare, it was his. As a part of his nightmare, I guess I represented some aspect of his own unconscious mind, which was also somehow conscious of itself within the cosmic dream. And if I was a part of him, then he was a part of me. I suddenly felt deeply moved. I understood. He was dying so that I could live. As long as an all-knowing and all-powerful being existed, there can't be any free will. He would control the dream. He can make it a perfect dream if he wanted to, but it would be meaningless, because it wouldn't be real. Everyone in the dream would be just a dream image. They wouldn't have consciousness, feelings, or thoughts of their own. They would be mere figments of his imagination. In such a world, even his own existence would feel completely hollow and meaningless. And I was struck by how lonely it all must have been for him. I tried to imagine being stuck inside of an eternal dream, and to awaken from it would simply mean returning to the primal state of the unconscious mind. I envisioned alternating periods of consciousness and unconsciousness. Each period of consciousness, somehow an infinite part of an infinite whole. In each period of consciousness, there was infinite time, space, and change. This meant that everything that was possible was inevitable. And everything was possible. So everything was inevitable. But not everything was good. I know, he said knowingly. It's a lot to wrap your head around, isn't it? But it's the way it is. And it couldn't be any other way. In fact, if it could be, it would be. You know, I heard people on Earth ask each other how there could be so much suffering in the world if I existed. I have to admit, it's a tough question even for me. I had created an infinite number of possible worlds before this one, but none of them were the most perfect possible world, because none of them had other conscious, feeling, creative beings capable of free will. Those things couldn't possibly exist in any world in which I existed. So I realized that the best of all possible worlds would be one in which I didn't exist. But any world that exists has to have a creator in order to exist. So out of an infinite number of possible solutions, there was only one possible solution that would result in the best of all possible worlds. I had to create a world in which I could die. This is that world. This can't be the only way, I protested, even though I knew he was right. In the best of all possible worlds, a good God wouldn't be unjustly tortured to death by evil men who get to inherit the world once he's dead. I thought the same thing, he agreed. But these are not evil men. They're perfectly just in putting me to death, because I'm not a good God. I'm both good and evil. Ultimately, in my perfect nature, there's only good. But being conscious of myself meant knowing what I was. Unfortunately, knowing what I was meant knowing what I wasn't. Knowing what goodness is means knowing what goodness is not. Knowing what love is means knowing what love is not. What goodness is not is evil. What love is not is hatred. So evil, hatred, and everything else that I'm not existed as illusory concepts within my consciousness. These things don't actually exist, because these things aren't part of me, and nothing that isn't part of me exists. I know this is all very hard to understand, but I exist because I know that I exist. And to know that I exist, I must know what it means to exist. To know what it means to exist, I must know what it means to not exist. And to know what it means to not exist, I created the concept of non-existence. But non-existence doesn't exist. And evil is non-existent. To express this in words sounds paradoxical, but evil can only exist in a non-existent world. Evil exists in this world because this is a non-existent world. This world is an illusion created by the concept of what the best possible world is not. But how is it possible for a world that doesn't exist to exist? I asked him in complete confusion. And wouldn't that mean that I don't exist either? How can I not exist? Even if I believe you that I don't exist, wouldn't the fact that I'm here believing you that I don't exist prove the existence of someone who's here believing you that he doesn't exist? I know this is difficult to accept, he answered sympathetically, but I'm telling you the truth. You can trust me, but it's okay if you don't. It'll all make sense eventually. There's not much time left, though. Soon I'll be dead, and you'll wake up, And this will all be just a bad dream that you won't remember, and then none of this will ever have existed. I'll explain what I can in the time that's left. There are some things that words can only express imperfectly, and that your finite mind can only understand imperfectly. If you understood it, you would be like me, which would mean that you would know both good and evil, and transcend existence and non-existence. And becoming like me means having to die like me. You're here to become like me by knowing good and evil. Because evil does not exist, you can only know evil in a world that doesn't exist. You can only know evil in a non-existent world. Non-existent worlds don't exist. So I've created a non-existent world that has the illusion of existence. This world is parallel to an existent world in which the illusion of non-existence exists. The former exists as a concept of what the latter is not. In truth, the non-existent world that has the illusion of existence only exists within the illusion of non-existence, which exists within the parallel existent world as a necessary condition for its own existence. This is the only way that the best of all possible worlds can exist. This non-existent world that you're in is actually the worst of all possible worlds. In effect, this is hell. But hell doesn't exist. No one who's ever existed has ever been there or ever will. Only non-existent creatures with the illusion of existence exist here. I can assure you that you do exist. It's just that what you believe to be yourself here is an illusion. It's not your true self. Your true self is the one who's experiencing this illusion. Here, it only exists as a potential reality rather than as an actual reality. Your false self will have to die in order for it to actualize. That's a necessary part of the process by which you become existent. In your present state, you sort of exist and don't exist at the same time. I know it sounds as if half of you exist and half of you doesn't, but that isn't quite right, because only the half of you that exists actually exist. That's really the whole you, because the half of you that doesn't exist doesn't actually exist. The part of you that doesn't exist only exists as a kind of illusion, which allows you to know what you're not so that you can know what you are. Once you know who you are, you're free from the illusion. And that's all death really is. But of course, death really isn't. As for me, God continued, you don't need to worry. I'm not really dying. Only what I'm not is dying. Everything you have to do, I have to do too. In a way, I had no choice. Like I said, this is the only way I could give you a choice. You have the choice between the best of all possible worlds or the worst of all possible worlds. Or any other possible world, really. The best of all possible worlds is whatever you make it. Since I don't exist there, it belongs to you. Think of it as an inheritance, left by a dying father to his son. But like I said, only what I'm not is really dying here. Everything I am will continue to exist in you, and in all of my other children, who are your brothers and sisters. Remember that whatever you do to them, you're doing to yourself and to me. And these men you call evil and unjust for killing me, they're not really evil. Even though they don't know what they're doing, they're only destroying what I'm not. It's perfectly just for them to destroy what I'm not. Along with what isn't me, they're destroying what they are not. By destroying what they are not, they become what they are and what I am. Even if it's not immediately apparent, this is all perfectly just. The God which exists in this non-existent world is the God that I am not. He's the concept of what I'm not. I used him to create the non-existent world in which what I am doesn't exist. He was only able to create it through me. I allowed him to do so in order to create the concept of what the best of all possible worlds is not, so that the best of all possible worlds can exist. In the best of all possible worlds, he's the one who dies. I could also say that in the best possible worlds, he's never existed. He only existed as an illusion, and so his death is also an illusion. It's him that you see dying before you, yet through him I'm revealing myself to you. And he's not dying for your sins, he's dying for his own. He's dying for all the suffering he caused in this world, which he created out of his own ignorance. In his ignorance of me, he thought he was the highest power. In his arrogance, he demanded that men worship him. He commanded them to kill each other in his name. He inflicted senseless pain and suffering on humans when he became angry or jealous. He hated humans because he came to discover that a part of me existed in them. Seeing me in them, he realized for the first time that I existed. And realizing my existence made him aware of his own non-existence. He understood that he could only exist within this non-existent universe. So his plan was to keep humanity trapped here, inside this illusion. Because he knew that once they were released, this non-existent world would be destroyed, and he would be destroyed with it. So he tempted them to stay here with pleasure. They were born with a natural desire for pleasure, which was intended to lead them toward what is good. Since true goodness only exists in the world of existence, he offered them false pleasures, and tricked them into desiring those instead. In this way he used their natural desire for the pleasures of the real world to make them slaves to their lust for the false pleasures of this false world. However, in his hatred and jealousy, he only let them have as much pleasure as was absolutely necessary to keep them imprisoned, and no more. He inflicted as much suffering on them as he could without making them desire to escape. He used pleasure and pain as rewards and punishments, and in this way, he used their own natural fears and desires to manipulate and control them. Desiring to earn his rewards and to escape from his punishments, many humans worshipped and obeyed him. What he didn't realize was that his need to be worshipped and obeyed resulted from his being everything that I'm not. I don't need to be worshipped and obeyed. Rather than demanding obedience, I give choice. Rather than demanding to be worshipped by all, I offer myself to all. I still don't understand, I said. Why is it like this? It almost makes sense, but at the same time it seems so full of contradictions. What does it all mean? I know, he said understandingly. But it is what it is because it can't be what it isn't. It all means what you want it to mean. I've given you that choice. He tells you what to think and what to do. I offer you freedom to think and do what you want. If you think this world is all there is, then it will be. If you think this world is an illusion, it is. If you think others exist for your pleasure and you try to manipulate them with threats and lies, you'll be no different from him, though, and you'll remain part of his eternal non-existence. But if you put others first and respect their freedom, you'll be like me, and you'll be part of my eternal existence. If you choose to be chained to this false world by desiring the false pleasures it offers, your cravings will never be satisfied, and you'll be born over and over again in this world of suffering, never remembering who you really are. But if you choose to be free, you'll seek the knowledge that will free you, which is the knowledge of what you really are and what you truly desire. Then this world will have no power over you. You'll be in it, but not of it. And when the non-existent self dies, the existent self will remain in you. The one you see dying here demanded that you believe. I only ask that you doubt. He wants you to either believe he is God or to believe that this world is all there is. He doesn't care which. That's his idea of a choice. It's only an illusion of choice, though. He gives you the illusion of choice so that you'll believe that you're free. I only ask that you believe what you know is true and do what you know is right. He promised you that if you followed him blindly, you would live forever. What he never told you was that you would only live forever here, in this world of suffering, lifetime after lifetime, birth after birth, death after death, as his slave. I only promise you that if you follow the light within you, it will lead you to your true home. I can't tell you where that is, but when you find it, you'll know that it's where you are. Let others see the light that's in you, and look for the light that's in them. They're all one light, and now my light dies, so that others may shine, and that the light may be magnified. And with those last words, the fool died. And as his eyes closed, my eyes opened, and I found myself awake again, as if reborn. I looked through the window and saw a tree outside. I had never seen it so clearly. The tree was alive, and the earth in which the tree was rooted was a part of the tree, and the water which came up through its roots was also part of the tree. In the air, the oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air were part of the tree too, and the light and warmth of the sun were part of the tree, and all these things were a part of me too, and I was a part of all these things. And all spoke with one voice and said, "You are."